Hello, I'm Harold Munro, editor-in-chief at the Vancouver Sun and Province. And joining us is City Hall columnist Dan Fumano. Hey, Dan, we were talking last week about the mayor's task force report that was supposed to come out, or we thought was coming out last week, and then we didn't get it. But we did learn a few things.
Yeah, so we were expecting to get the final report last week from this mayor's task force. The mayor earlier this year called a press conference and announced that he was convening this task force of outside experts, accountants, and people with private sector and some public sector experience to basically go through the budget and try to find efficiencies, because the mayor was trying to say that the big 10.7% property tax increase that council approved to fund the 2023 budget, he was saying, he doesn't want that to become the norm. So they're trying to get some bright minds from outside of City Hall to look at the budget, try to find efficiencies. It was on the agenda last week that it said that we were going to be getting the final report from the task force, but we didn't actually get that. And this is almost 2 months after we had initially expected the final report to be delivered.
Right.
It was initially supposed to be delivered in the first week of October. So anyway, instead of getting the final report last week, what we got was sort of a progress update. And there was no report or documents made available to the public or the media, but the chair of the task force got up and gave a presentation to council and sort of gave them a general progress update, saying that it was proving more difficult than they had thought. It is a big task. And it's basically saying that a final report should be coming now. We're expecting it in mid-January. He said in mid-January, they'll deliver a report. It'll be available to the public and to council, and it'll include recommendations there for some things the council could look at changing around the budget or the budgeting process.
Right. So a lot of it, I watched some of the presentation, and a lot of it was processy, as you just said, around I think we can expect a lot of recommendations around that. But there were a few things I guess, naming rights or contracting out or
Yep.
public-private partnerships. Were there any specific examples, or are we going to have to wait for that as well?
There wasn't very much specific. It was a pretty general kind of
Okay.
broad presentation, but it did touch on some things that we've certainly heard before. People like me who have sat through a lot of these city budget processes every year. The chair of the task force was kind of commenting on, before he took this role, and these people are doing this as a volunteer role, as sort of a public service to the city. They're not being paid for their time. So it is, a pretty significant volunteer commitment from these people trying to help the public. And he was saying before he had gotten involved, he did not really anticipate the size and cost of the city's infrastructure needs, all this underground stuff that we don't really ever think about, but the sewers that need upgrading and how expensive all of that is. And he was commenting on what a big surprise that is and how much pressure that puts on the budget. Now, I was chatting with some of the city councilors, like Adrienne Carr, who's the longest serving councilor. She's with the Green Party and she's been on council longer than anybody. And she was kind of surprised that he was surprised. She said, these infrastructure issues, anybody who's watched a city budget meeting in the past know this comes up every year. This is not a new thing. We know these are huge challenges. But I guess, to be fair, a lot of people don't watch the budget meetings every year and maybe don't necessarily appreciate all of these different contributors to the budget. And
Well,
the chair of the task force.
It's not really a sexy topic for politicians, right? They don't go out and do big grand ribbon cuttings at sewer pipes and water pipes, and so often these things do get postponed or delayed because they're not. It's not like opening a bridge or a new community center where you can score political points.
Yeah, exactly. But it's hugely expensive, and obviously it's very important. I mean, people don't really think about their pipes and sewer and stuff unless all of a sudden there's a problem and it's not working, and then that's even more expensive. So
how did we get so far behind? I mean, it's probably a really complicated question, but how did we wind up with a $500 million deficit?
Well, I mean, I think they are supposed to sort of replace a certain amount of the infrastructure every year, but when there's other pressures on the budget, all these different departments, all these different priorities that city council wants to be seen to be supporting, I think sometimes in the past, infrastructure spending would get sort of reduced. Say, oh, we could instead of replacing 1% of our sewer pipes this year, we'll just replace 0.5%, and that'll save a lot of money, and most people may not notice it. So this is going back I'm talking about previous past councils. Of course, every time you do that, you get further and further behind. But as you
Right.
say, it's not really a sexy issue, and it's not something that most people campaign on. People aren't going to campaign to say, hey, I'm going to use more of your tax money to fund new sewers. But it is definitely something I know that you talk to um, people in City Hall and some of the politicians, and it is something that is a big concern for them. And obviously, the chair of this task force said for them, once they finally had a chance to go through the hundreds and hundreds of pages of information and really learn the inner workings of the city budget, for them, it was a big concern, is a big takeaway as well, is just how expensive these infrastructure needs are. And he commented how much the city is kind of left on its own. It's not getting a ton of support from the provincial and federal governments. So that was another repeated theme, not only in the infrastructure thing, but with other areas that the city spends increasing amounts of money on. The chair of the task force was saying a lot of this stuff we should be getting funding from the federal or provincial governments, which again, of course, for people who have sat through these things, we hear that every year. We hear that, I'm sure, every city manager, every city CFO, every city councilor and mayor, going back however many years, obviously wants to be getting more funding and more support from the senior governments. But
Right. Yes. Well, and we hear it from TransLink, and we hear it from Metro Vancouver, and you hear it from every level of
yeah,
government wants to push up and try to get more money from the level of government above them.
yeah,
Province wants more money for healthcare from the feds, etc.
yeah,
The other thing he talked about, which I thought was interesting, and I'm very much looking forward to in the final report, was this idea that Vancouverites pay more for services than they get back.
yes,
Again, in terms of, I guess, perhaps regional infrastructure and some of those huge pressures that we know are happening. That sets up a potentially difficult conversations, because we have a regional government that, as you know, it has to operate cooperatively. It doesn't really operate under any sort of legislative control. There's no elected mayor of Metro, so they all have to get along to make this thing work. Um,
well, I guess the chair of Metro is elected by their counterparts, the other politicians from the region, right?
yeah, but he's not elected as the mayor. He's not
Yeah,
elected as the mayor of Metro Vancouver the way you have in Toronto or other metro
sure.
regions, right? We have a mayor and
Calgary, yeah,
council
yeah,
that's elected. You're right. They all have representation and they all have like a weighted vote on there. And
yeah, but it's not like
Vancouver,
the
as a
residents of Metro
population,
Vancouver. Yeah,
yeah, Vancouver got outvoted uh,
yeah,
on the issue of the infrastructure
yes.
DCCs, right? So you're starting to see that split or that bit of that rift between Vancouver being the urban power and Surrey being the suburban power. There's a bit of a rift developing there, I think.
Yeah, yes. Um,
But what is
yeah.
this idea that Vancouver pays more than they get back? Is that
Yeah, so I didn't get a chance to speak with the task force chair about that in detail, but that was one of the elements of the presentation that sort of caught my attention. He was making the argument that City of Vancouver, by virtue of its sort of status as the hub of a broader region, it has the most expensive real estate. It's kind of the business and
Mhm.
cultural kind of epicenter of the region, even though it's only a quarter of the metro population. It has, a disproportionate amount of the jobs and the commerce going on here. The port, and it's this. So he was making the argument that in terms of various taxes, like speculation and vacancy tax, and the additional school tax on high value properties. He was saying that the city of Vancouver, and I don't have the information in front of me where he got these numbers from, but he was trying to make the argument that the city of Vancouver is paying more to the province in the form of all of those various taxes than it's getting back in terms of
in
provincial support.
transfers?
So that's
Mm.
something I would like to try to get more information
Yes.
about this claim and how he's come to these numbers, because I'm guessing that this will form a significant part of the task force's final report. That's kind of the indication we got, but obviously, as we
Okay.
say, we're not getting get a look at that task force's final report until next year, which
Okay.
seems to suggest that maybe the budget, there won't be any final decisions around the 2024 operating budget until next
Okay.
year.
Right, because you're very far along in the budget for next year, and I know that you attended some presentations by the fire department, the police department around their budget needs, and they're in a bit of a difficult spot. Hey.
Well, I mean, the fire and police departments were both coming to council last year to ask for more money, kind of to cover this past year's budget. They got, their 2023 operating budget was approved. at the start of this year, early this year. And then both departments kind of ran deficits this year, ran shortfalls, which doesn't happen every year. Both departments were saying there were kind of reasons for these extraordinary one-time pressures. So both departments will be coming to council basically tomorrow as part of the annual budgeting. I mean, I expect they'll be there tomorrow. There's a special meeting for the budget. Both departments will be coming to ask for more money for their 2024 budgets going forward. The Vancouver Police Board has already approved its kind of recommended 2024 budget, but then so that will go to council for final decision. But the budget that the police board approved 2 weeks ago, or the budget that they've approved is higher than what city staff are recommending in their draft budget. So it's going to be up to council if they want to go with what city staff had considered, or if they want to meet the police board's recommended budget. But yeah, just last week, you had both the police and the fire departments in council asking for more money to cover shortfalls from this past year. Largely, it was about $6 million from the police department and a little bit less than $6 million from the Vancouver Fire and Rescue Services largely to cover benefits. There were some adjustments made with the way benefits were working, and for largely it's for overtime costs. Staff paying out significantly more in overtime to both departments.
Why so much overtime?
So with the case of the police, the reason they gave was the extra staffing resources required to handle sort of decampment of these tent cities, encampments. There was the big decampment back in April that was kind of led by the city staff, but supported by police were on site, providing security and trying to keep things safe. So there was that major decampment of East Hastings back in April. But apart from that as well, since then and before then, there's kind of ongoing regular decampment when encampments start to pop up around town. And the police department are saying that is using a lot of resources to try to keep up with that. And then there's also just, there were a lot of protests. The number of protests and the size of them, according to the police department, has really increased. And of course, again, Vancouver, being only a quarter of Metro's population, but it's the sort of hub where a lot of these big protests, whether it's national issues, global issues, you've got people protesting various sides of global geopolitical issues.
Right.
And a disproportionate amount of those happen within the city of Vancouver. So the city of Vancouver, the Vancouver Police Department is responsible for providing security, often road closures and things like that. For these kinds of protests. And unlike if you have a public event or a festival or something, the festival organizers are paying. If you have an outdoor concert or something, you're paying for the police presence. But protests, the public is on the hook for that. Obviously, and the police department says they take it seriously, that it's people in Canada have the right to exercise their right to protest and get out, but it is putting a lot of pressure on the budget, they say. I think there are some other issues as well, but those are sort of the two that they named. With the fire department, largely, they're just having a lot of overtime required because of the number of sick claims and people on leave, in some cases extended leaves. And this is for a variety of reasons. I asked the fire chief about this last week at City Hall, and she was saying that, there are a number of people on lengthy leaves because of cancer. Cancer is much more common among firefighters than it is in the general population. And then there are a lot of people on stress leaves. And as we've heard in various media stories over the years, there's a lot of firefighters in Vancouver and elsewhere, probably in BC, who have PTSD, who are on stress leaves. And there's a lot of factors that contribute to this. And so the fire chief said you can't say just one thing, but there's no way around the fact that the overdose crisis, the number of overdose calls, and then it's just been sustained for so long, takes a real toll on these first responders. And some of the fire departments in Vancouver, some of the fire halls are responding to way, way more calls than an average fire hall in Canada. They're very, very busy, and they're dealing with these challenging calls where people are overdosing and, and in many cases dying. And in some cases, they're reviving the same person multiple times. And it is a difficult job for these firefighters. And this has been covered before. And so obviously when people are on stress leave and they need staffing levels, they have to pay overtime for people to staff these fire halls. So there's no easy answer for any of this stuff.
You'll hear more about this at the special budget meeting tomorrow, and as well as other things, and we can talk about them next week. Thanks, Dan.
Yes. Yep, lots more budget talk to come.